As I said, very warm welcome to all of you for this one of the first parallel session of the conference, a panel on global value chains and a confused world order. So, I'm Lucia Piscitello. I'm from University of Reading and Politecnico di Milano. And I'm very pleased. My job this morning is to shortly introduce this panel and chair the panel. So, keeping it down, basically. So, let me see if it is working. Okay. So, research on global value chain and disintegration of activities by multinational enterprises has been usually associated to the process of globalization, to integration of world markets by trade, to the growing interconnectedness, interdependencies among places, also stimulated by technological advances and new technologies. On the right side of the slide, instead, recently, however, the winds of de-globalization, basically, are blowing, and phenomena like, as we know, populism, nationalist regime taking position against major trade blocs, free movements of goods, of people, and therefore phenomena like backshoring, reshoring, restructuring of the global value chains, shortening of the global value chains are taking place. Oh, so, okay. And so this panel brings together 4 distinguished scholars, okay, I don't know what happened, thank you, Peter, 4 distinguished scholars in IB and business history, as we believe it is also looking at the past that we could find insights, directions, if not answers, to the current discomfort that we are experiencing in such a confused world order. So our panelists, as I said, 4 panelists, we'll start with Mark Casson from the University of Reading, Teresa da Silva Lopes from the University of York, Rolf Peter Amdam from BI, Norwegian Business School, and Jean-François Hennart from Tilburg University, Politecnico di Milano, and Vienna as a discussant. So the questions that we address to our panel are the following. So first, what has been the impact of GVCs on globalization and deglobalization processes, and on the other hand, how have trends toward globalization and deglobalization shaped the boundaries of GVCs? And second, how different are the dynamics of GVC coordination and governance in periods of globalization and deglobalization? Okay, so I'm now very pleased to leave the floor to our panelists. The structure of the panel will be the following. We will have the 3 panelists going in a row, 10 minutes, 12 minutes each, and then we will have about 10 minutes discussion. So, as I said, I'm very pleased to leave the floor to our first panelist. Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. So.
Well, I thought I'd like to pick up on one of the issues raised in the plenary last night, actually, which is about confusion, and ask basically who's confused and what are they confused about. And there are several ways of looking at this. One is the system itself confused. Is it dysfunctional global order that we have? Secondly, are ordinary people confused? And thirdly, are in fact we confused? Are we the source of our own confusion? And I'm going to suggest that possibly we are, to some degree, a source of our own confusion. And I want to begin by just commenting on the terminology of global value chains, which is in fact a concept to some extent imported from Wallerstein's sort of Marxist interpretation of the global economy and a bit of Michael Porter value chain jargon as well. But in fact, I prefer the name that they were always called before they became fashionable, and that is international supply chains, because these supply chains aren't global, many of them. They are just international, and they're not value. I mean, what on earth does value mean? I mean, they're about production and distribution. So calling them international supply chains is, I think, not just a matter of sort of fetish. It's a matter of getting some analytical clarity into the subject. And once we realise that we can get some clarity, we realise also that we've got a history. We've got a history of theorising about this, beginning with Sune Carlson's study on the pure theory of production, which analysed multi-stage production in considerable detail. Theories of vertical integration, internalisation theory, Buckley and Casson, Hennart, Dunning, whatever. I mean, all these in the 1970s and early 80s discussed effectively what we now call global value chains. And furthermore, they're not a new phenomenon. I mean, there are examples in the Italian and European and British textile industries since the year 1200, which have left records, including records of the actual organisation of the process in the multi-stage production of textiles. Iron and steel, tropical fruit export, all of these have been studied both by international business scholars and also by business historians. Jean-Francois contributed to a book I edited in 1986, which contained a series of industry case studies dealing with international supply chains. Furthermore, the basic idea of modular production systems where different modules can be located at different countries isn't new either. Peter, in the guise of Global Factory and others have pointed out, we can trace ideas on the division of labour back to Adam Smith. And the idea of specialisation is often just simply you become good at whatever you do if you repeat it often enough. There's also a comparative advantage view that you should concentrate on those things you're comparatively better at relative to other people. There's location specialisation based on the fact that certain locations are better adapted than other locations to carrying out certain specialised activities that require certain types of labour skill and so on. So really, I don't understand why there's so much sort of fuss about the novelty of them. Even logistics is well, I mean, if you look at the Journal of Supply Chain Management, there's loads of stuff, and operations management journals, OR journals, they all deal with the logistics of supply chains, the movement of goods between countries, warehousing, transshipment, intermodal flows of goods, etc. So, in a way, don't we all understand it? Well, except for one crucial thing. Now, some people understand this and some don't. There have been a couple of recent papers in top journals which demonstrate a lamentable lack of understanding of the point I'm going to make. And that is, just consider yourself as an entrepreneur who wants to set up a production process that is multi-stage. So you've identified, say, a cheap source of a raw material in one place, and you've identified an unsatisfied demand for a sophisticated product made out of that material at another place. You want to appropriate the profit from your mental cognitive capability of spotting that the inputs are cheap and that the final output is dear, and you can make a profit out of that. Would you, in the course of organising your supply chain, sell your product to an intermediate supplier and then buy it back from them? Obviously you wouldn't, because you'd be holding yourself hostage to them. What you would say is, throughout the chain, this product is mine, I am paying you to work on it. And this means that ownership of the product is different from ownership of the factory, employment of the workers, and other activities. Once you understand this basic point, then it becomes clear what is involved in subcontracting arrangements and what their nature is. And in the 1970s, when we had investment review agencies and the like, people could get hold of the contracts to actually examine what these contracts actually said. But very little literature today actually bothers to look at the content of the contracts, nor do people in IB often interview the subcontractors themselves. They just interview the supply chain leaders who talk to them about strategy. But the point is, therefore, that because ownership of the product tends to remain in the same hands throughout the chain, many of the issues relating to the appropriation of rents from the chain are also clarified. You can take this further. George Stiegler in 1951 discussed the issue of how supply chains develop, often out of the result of an innovative firm that develops a supply chain. The suppliers then realise that they can maybe sell their own product rather than just sell the supply chain leader's product back to them. And so often the development of an integrated supply chain by a pioneer leads to the development of alternative low-cost disintegrated supply chains which gradually come to compete against it. And I discuss this in this particular slide. So if we then just backtrack from this perspective to the historical evidence, is it true that supply chains are exploitative, that they promote inequality? The answer, I think, is yes, because effectively the entrepreneurs who have these global visions of linking cheap inputs to expensive outputs are going to make big profits. And these are going to be people located at the kind of places which act as international communications hubs, which generally means big cities in sophisticated developed countries that can provide them with the information infrastructure and the skilled management people that they need. And likewise out among the subcontractors. Some subcontractors may be hired not so much because they're good at their job as because they're good at evading regulations about health and safety, that they have a quasi-enslaved workforce to draw on, like the children of their own employees and this sort of thing. So clearly supply chains can exist because the subcontractors can perpetrate abuses that the supply chain leader would be reluctant to commit themselves. So clearly there are some issues. The same thing, though, about defining your terms in looking at supply chains and understanding them properly, I think also applies to concepts of globalization and deglobalization. I edited a book series for Edward Elgar, which composed about 26 books, all of other people's work, based on globalization. And for that purpose, it was necessary to define what we mean. And if deglobalization is the opposite of globalization, then we can simply define deglobalization in terms of reversing globalization, which is generally understood to be what it says on the slide behind me. So effectively, we can define and analyze our international supply chains. We can define and analyze deglobalization. And then we can ask, well, what is all the fuss about? Well, it seems to me that, now going back to where I started with the discussion last night, international supply chains cannot really be held up as the fundamental cause of many people's disenchantment with the economic system. Because in a way, although they do perpetrate certain injustices, they are still embedded in a kind of wider system. And if I were to suggest what the role of global value chains is in this discontent and this lack of clarity in the situation, I would say that they amplify a problem that is endemic in globalization. And that is that simply from a social point of view, if you live in a deglobalized world where every village, every little township, every little suburb has its own community, it doesn't deal with anybody, then everybody to some extent is important. And the top person in that community is number one in the world because the world consists of that little group. As you integrate these communities, so you get immigrants coming in and emigrants going out, and the community becomes less cohesive, and that means that you feel disempowered because you are less familiar with the other people in the group. Furthermore, as you begin to integrate these groups through things like international value chains, people begin to realize that the key decisions affecting their entire group aren't made by anyone they know in their group. They're made by someone else whom they never meet and never see and who never seems to consult them. And the only message they ever get is, you lot are uncompetitive, we know somebody else that you don't know who's better than you are, so you can get stuff. We're closing down the factory and we're going to move the work elsewhere, and you have no idea why that's happened, you have no say in it, and so forth. So it seems to me that the process of global integration itself does tend to undermine the sense of self-government or autonomy within local communities. And I think if you look at the mantras that we've had recently in the election, like take back control, it is actually taking back control of the local community. People do care about who lives next to each other. People do care about whether there's a shop in the community and a church in the community and so forth. And effectively, I think the economic logic of efficiency seeking has been allowed to trump concerns over social justice, self-respect and others that are expressed through the politics of the local community. So it seems to me that it's not impossible to use the ideas from international business to actually analyse these issues. And one obvious metaphor is to think of the headquarters subsidiary relationship and the relationship between an impersonal and distant headquarters that disempowers and autocratically controls and manipulates demotivated employees in a subsidiary. So in a way we have a political and social analogue of the economic and managerial pyramid of the multinational firm with its headquarters and subsidiaries. So my conclusion is basically, yes, international supply chains are a complex phenomenon, but they can be understood. But we've made a bit of a mess of understanding them by allowing some fallacies and misunderstandings to remain uncorrected. What we need to do, therefore, is to firstly bring clarity to our thinking and then to extend our methods of thinking beyond the narrow range of the management of international operations to the wider range of the management by politicians of the global economy.
So I'm going to provide the business historian's angle, and then I think Rolf Petter will do the same. So I'm going to look at how globalization and deglobalization shape the boundaries of global value chains by also not only just using history, but also transaction costs kind of as a concept. So first I'd like to introduce the concepts that I found relevant, because this analysis is basically focused on the periods of deglobalization and the confused world, just like Mark and the topic of the session. So value chains, the way I'm using it, relates to activities within a specific industry or across industries, is connected with competitive advantages, and also can relate to a single firm that may consist of a link or can be vertical integrated. Then I also, like Mark, distinguish the concept of value chain from international supply chains. International supply chains have always existed historically and were very common in the commodity trading in particular, and they were very much associated with vertical networks and therefore firms and their products. And the concept of global value chain per se, Mark mentioned the theory developed, well, theoretical analysis developed more in the 1980s, but the phenomena become much more frequent from the 1970s, even though there's historical work that shows there are companies already organizing global value chains before. But the 1970s is really the period where companies start to fragment into networks, not just as firms having activities and producing components in different parts of the world, but also with other companies. Then there's another concept that I'm going to use, and now that's why I introduce it here. I'm going to talk about brands, which are not very much discussed in the concept of global value chains, so in opposition to technology, which this hard side of innovation, which tends to get much more attention in research. And brands are important because they create differentiation and reputation. And reputation is, as we know, is the researchers, by Granovetter and others have talked about that they emerges as a result of social network effects. And there is another concept that I will sort of introduce, and I'll stop in terms of concepts, is trust. And trust is very mediated by reputation, and it relates to the expectation about the future behavior of a trading partner, where a false expectation may bring about considerable costs. So I go from brands to reputation and trust. And I'll explain in a minute why these concepts are relevant in periods of deglobalization. So while in the 19th century, the research that, I don't know how to, this is Jean-François, so, here. 19th century, business historians do a lot of, and myself, and of course Jeffrey Jones and Miro Wilkins, they do a lot of work on the, development of multinational activity during the first global economy, and so does Rolf Petter, of course. And in this period, there was a highly centralized and global trade connections in raw materials and exporting finished goods. And in the 20th century, the second wave of globalization, the second global economy, it's has very different characteristics. There is integration which goes from 1979 to roughly 2008 when we have the financial crisis. It's a period of integration of markets by trade, FDI, movements of people, capital and knowledge. There is a high level of disintegration of production, and the role of networks as a driving force in the co-evolution of cross-border industrial organization becomes very important. The period from the new deglobalization period, well, some people consider that might be just stagnation. It's characterized by a financial crisis, but now we have Brexit, and which causes a lot of uncertainty. We have Trump. We have rising labor costs in emerging markets. We have increasing energy prices and high transportation costs. We have protectionism and populism and racism and nationalism, and which Mark just discussed, and equality is also, even though we are all sort of richer compared to the 19th century, there is huge inequality even within the same countries. And there is one big issue which is discussed every day on newspapers, the loss of trust in terms of people, the leaders, and institutions. Many people I talked to know to vote this time. So the period I'm going to actually provide some analysis is to look at what can we learn from previous globalization periods. So just to introduce the concept of transaction costs into this discussion, and how can transaction costs and history help explain multinational strategies in periods of deglobalization. I'll start by explaining what theory says about transaction costs in periods of globalization. You have low barriers to trade and investment, so therefore you are likely to have low opportunism and low bounded reliability and high trust. And this enables the development of global value chains and the access to talent, dispersed talent pool. But it creates, as Liana Cano and others have mentioned, that it creates orchestration costs for the lead multinational enterprise. But in periods of deglobalizations, there is a bit of a reversal of all these advantages. You have high barriers to trade and investment. You have high transaction costs in drafting contracts and monitoring. You have high bounded rationality and uncertainty. You have high bounded reliability, high risk, and going back to my story, low trust and reputation issues become very prominent. So based on this idea, this theoretical aspect, how have multinational firms with multinational activity dealt historically with deglobalization? And for that purpose, I'm going to use just some sort of schematics, explanations of what's, related to historical research. But what I want to highlight is that my research, I tend to look at industries that are marketing-based rather than technology-based, so where brands are very important and develop global business is very, very strongly related to brands. But technology also has a component. But one aspect that is very interesting that I found is that in periods of deglobalization, brands actually become much more prominent, even in industries that are technology-based, than in other periods, because they become mediators of trust and reputation. And they are very much associated with changes in governance of who controls the chain, changes in organizational designs in terms of headquarters and subsidiaries, and changes in coordination mechanisms in terms of using market hierarchies or cooperation. I'll give you I hope this doesn't look very complicated, but this is just the value chain. And what this basically shows is that, for example, the case of bicycle industry, during the period of interwar period, Germany had lost, I have to be next to the stage because of the recording, Germany had lost a reputation because of the First World War. And Germany was producing much cheaper bicycles than the British. And so exports to Britain were very important in terms of finished goods. But because of issues of reputation, British people were resistant to buy German brands. So what happened is that actually there was a huge increase in the export of components. So they go from exporters to third-party suppliers. And what happened is that there were these small, not the big bicycle producers like Raleigh, etc., but the small producers from Coventry and Birmingham were actually assembling all the components from Germany and putting their brand names, even though they were not famous, they were British, and the brand moved along the value chain because of this issue. So they were hiding the brand. Another example where the brand moved in the value chain during periods of globalization was in the personal care during the interwar, again, Second World War. What happens is we have companies in personal care such as Beiersdorf, and they were based in Germany, and again, they were multinational, fully fledged multinational enterprise with activities in different parts of the world. But there was this issue of assets being from the enemy territory and brands being owned by enemies. So what did they do? They created, they basically disconnected the headquarters from Germany to all the affiliates in different parts of the world, and the Netherlands they created what was called a ring structure. They basically cloaked themselves as a Dutch company. So the Netherlands became kind of the main affiliate, which was sort of coordinating all the activities of multinational, of the affiliates in different parts of the world. And then what they did with the brand was that they either created contracts when possible with local agents, or actually in many cases they were just word of mouth. After the war, it took them many, many years until the 80s and 90s in different parts of the world to recover the brands. But just to show another example of cloaking, where the brand, in order to, the reputation and the brand moved along the value chain and associated with organizational design. Another example is the case of diamond industry, and I guess we all know about De Beers. They created a cartel which completely controlled prices and was based on trust relationships, and if producers and buyers didn't come to, so there was one brand where all the producers and the buyers were going. This was after the 1930s, when there was a decline in the demand for diamonds, and so then suddenly the prices go up, and then but again the brand becomes very powerful. And finally there is another research that I've done, for example, on the match industry from Japan, where they were in the 19th centuries they were outsourcing designs from China for all their brands because they were very innovative. So it's an interesting story. But what happens because of the Manchurian incident in the 1930s, which led eventually to the Second Sino-Japanese War, they had to backshore their outsourcing of design. So in conclusion, how has globalization and deglobalization shaped the boundaries of firms? We know that globalization leads to global value chains which become quite important engines of growth or with impact on not just economic development of specific countries, but also they have huge responsibility, corporate social responsibility and sustainability, for example in carbon emissions, and human rights obligations, for example in issues of discrimination and child labor. In periods of deglobalization and crisis, there is a higher propensity for disruption of global value chains, and so this leads to changes in the level of coordination, governance and power, and new organization designs. But a very important point I wanted to highlight is that the brands, contrary to just, in opposition to technology, they become very strategic in the management, in global value chains, because they are association with the issue of trust and reputation. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm also a historian. I will take a historical perspective. And a little bit underline the concept confused world. And I tried to follow the discussion in IB, and I see that recently there are some debates over this year in some of these good journals on globalization and international business. For instance, Witt, he argues that there is a need for a deeper integration of politics in IB studies on deglobalization and its consequences for research on global value change. There is also in this special issue on Gibbs on the internalization theory. There is a paper arguing that internationalization theory should incorporate insights from global value change theory. And they address questions like, why do lead firms wish to maintain control over externalized global value change activities? And they argue that the move internalization theory towards a better understanding of the middle ground between the market and the hierarchies. And Benito and others, they are a little bit critical to this, but say that global value change could be a good systemic construct to study this thing. My perspective is that this has in a way inspired me, without I'm not going to discuss it in detail. So my perspective would then be to discuss how can historical studies be used to expand our knowledge about the impact of deglobalization on international business by using global value change approach to identify processes of internalization or externalization. And unlike the other ones, I will take a narrow focus. I will have a case, a very small case, and not the broad picture. So in respect to the organizer of this session, I will talk about bacalhau, which is the national dish in Portugal. Fantastic dish. And the fish, of course, comes from Norway. So that's the value chain. This is produced in a way that this is the old way. It's produced by fishing the fish, basically cod, but not only cod. So call it codfish is not correct. But most of it's cod. And traditionally it was salted and still salted, and then it was dried on the rocks by women, when it was sun, of course, and then exported to Portugal and other countries. And in this story there is a bottle of port wine. For those of us like food and wine, we all like bacalhau and port wine, but we also know that it doesn't fit completely well together. And they make some confusion also in this story here. And the story is about period of deglobalization basically in my case, starting with the First World War, ending in the, or during the Middle War period up to the 40s. So, what do I want to say? So I will use this the case to illustrate some of my points. And I will start with this statistic here. And this shows the export of Norwegian, I call it clipfish, because that is not only cod, and it's not correct to call it dried fish because it's dried and salted. So clipfish is something used in a more kind of, among specialists, also in English. And this is the export of this fish from 1900 to 1925%, and we see that in Spain lost the position as the main market for Norwegian fish, and Portugal became the winner. This was a totally change in the system of producing and exporting and sales of clipfish. And in this period also the Latin America came into the statistic, which I will come back to, in fact, because it's quite important in my perspective. So at the same time as Portugal became the most important market for clipfish, Norway became the most important market for port wine. And of course there was a link because the Norwegian want to sell the fish and the Port want to sell the wine. And this has to do with the story I will come back to. So illustrate this fact that there's also a question about chaos. If we split the statistic and go into detail, not only every 5 years, we see that in 1992 there were no export to Portugal, not at all. And that was because of the wine. Because the Norwegian had decided that we should not drink strong alcohol in Norway. It was forbidden to drink strong wine and spirit, only red wine, and which of course resulted in the fact that the Portuguese couldn't export their wine. And then they say, then we don't want our clipfish. So it was a chaos. It was solved in a way that Norway had to import million bottles of port wine, and then we could sell as much fish as we wanted. And we imported so much wine that we had to, that were more than we drank. So they had to just get rid of it some years. So that's an interesting case. So this is in fact where I will start. So this raises in a way two questions. Is when did really deglobalization start? And then is this really a case about global value chain, or is it just a question about international trade? I'll try to answer this, see if I succeed. I think that's something I want to discuss with you. I think maybe this kind of globalization into deglobalization is a bit of simplification. Because what we see during this period is what I will call a period of institutional turbulence. There is a period between globalization ends and deglobalization starts, and you see where it goes. And in this period here, there is a lot of turbulence institutionally, and I will illustrate those things here. That has an impact on the behavior on the actors in international business. And to illustrate this kind of turbulence, I try to mention some of the key changes in this period in a kind of, on the one hand, typical for market economy, globalization on the other hand, more into the deglobalization and the hierarchy organization, and try to illustrate this kind of turbulence. Most of all, in Portugal, in a period from 1914 to 1929, it was an open market, limited regulation for the sale or the distribution of port fish. So that was the market coordination in 1929, except for this kind of the trade war in 21-23, when Norwegian were not allowed to export fish. 1914 became the war. In our case, extremely important, because before 1914, most of the fish were exported through Germany, and all the fish to Latin America was exported through Germany. And not only exported, but they also did what they call the grading. And grading means that we take the fish, take a look at the quality, the degree of salt, the color, and say that this is fish for Italy, this is fish for Portugal, and this is fish for Spain, because they have different preferences. So that's a kind of branding, giving it the Norwegian branding, not the firm branding, but the national grade branding. But due to the war, it ended. So the Norwegians state introduced the system of grading itself, which meant that suddenly Latin America came into the statistics because it was not re-exported anymore. In this period, there was a kind of period of Norwegian monopoly on clipfish export for some years, which is more into the hierarchy side. And it was, of course, the gold standard and the currency change that created a lot of things, without going into detail on that. Then we had a grading law, which gave it a kind of added value on the Norwegian side. I will come back to the trade war with restrictions. And then after the trade war, the trade agreement allowing us to export clipfish and import wine. In that period, between 21 and 29, there was an open market in Portugal, an expanding market. And what's important in international business perspective is that both in Norway there were communities of Portuguese, and in Portugal there were communities of Norwegians. They were agents to sell, But in this period, they used this kind of market freedom to expand into the retail activities by establishing their own companies, which created a lot of reaction from the Portuguese side. On the other hand, the Portuguese, they came to Norway and started to import. But not only import, they also went into other activities that I will come back to. So this created a new kind of regulation towards a more corporate system, towards hierarchy, towards the Portuguese cooperatives that came in the 30s, and Norwegian cartels in 35 on export of clipfish. So my point is that there is a kind of period here which is that we don't know exactly where we will head it, whether there is a competition between those. And this may be also relevant for today's period or debate about globalization or deglobalization. I think that that's something that we could discuss. So is this really a question about global value chains? I know that I don't find any global fabric in this kind here, so that could be discussed, but I think there are something that could be relevant here. First of all, there is this kind of, the end of re-export via Germany created the changes in this branding system by grading where the fish were graded. A second argument I would say that is that due to these changes here, the localization of the export in Norway changed from one city, Kristiansund, to another city, Ålesund, which had the kind of more entrepreneurial firms and had another business mindset. But the most important thing is the fact that the Norwegian exported, they expanded from being purely agents in Portugal to establish their own activities. And they did it in a way because the legal system said that you could have only one agent in Portugal. They solved the problem by establishing several companies in Norway so they could have several agents that did the retailing. And the Portuguese, they came to Norway, not only to do the import, but they invested in fishing vessels to do the fishing and to do the processing. And they also went back to Portugal and imported fish from Norway, salted but dried it in Portugal in a way to do the manufacturing in the other country. So there was a kind of chaos also in the system. So what I tried to say is, first of all, bringing history and research on previous periods of deglobalization into the international business could be useful. I won't push that argument. The second thing is that I think it could be worth reflect on this topic, institutional turbulence, as a transition period of institutional instability between two periods of institutional stability and between globalization and deglobalization. And the third thing is that because most of this information is from the report of the consular, and both in Norway and in Portugal, these kind of local representative from governments were key institutions to interpret the political signal from the government. And that's also what it is today. There are a lot of kind of units around, technical delegations, research delegations in several countries, more or less linked to the embassies that interpret the signals. And their role in this kind of transition from one period to another one, I think that's something that is worth studying also in modern times. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk a bit about statistics. Usually I'm a theory guy, but this time I'm going to be a bit of a fact guy. Not fact, fact. And I want to talk a bit about, there was a report by the McKinsey Global Institute on value chain, which I found very interesting because it throws a light on many other explanations of why value chains can increase or decrease in terms of their globalization. So globalization basically is the share of exports in the total output of goods in a value chain.
this is what McKinsey did. They basically traced their own value chain and they looked at their globalization and their growth and their degree of globalization. I was interested, this is the A350 logistics network for the assembly of the wing. This is, was of course called Project Fear, as you know. You can see here what the problem that global value chains have when you've got trade conflict between, or trade separation between the countries. And you can see the share that actually the wing assembly in the UK as parts that come from two places in the UK, but also from Spain and from Germany. And then the wing, part of it is assembled in England, then sent back to Bremen for additional assembly, and then sent back to Toulouse for final assembly. So you can see how vulnerable today's value chains can be to political disruption. But anyway, the report by McKinsey basically makes, I think, 5 important points. So if you look at the degree of globalization of a value chain, it's basically the ratio of exports to the total value, total amount of goods produced in the value chain. So some value chains can be entirely domestic, and some of them can be highly international. So this is what this report looks like. And basically they found out that in terms of goods producing value chain, it's actually there's been a decrease between 1995 and 2017. There was a decrease actually in the trade intensity of the value chain. So the decrease in the value chain actually predates the political trouble with Brexit and with Trump. But this is only true for goods producing value chains. In terms of service producing value chains, in fact, we have a growth of those the international degree of this value chain. There's a decrease of the typical value chain based on labor cost arbitrage, which is becoming less important, but an increase in value chains which are higher technology value chains. So this is basically the 5 points I want to make, which the report brings in. So the first point is what are the factors behind the change? And one important aspect of the change is that emerging countries, especially China, which used to be specializing on exports, are now actually consuming a higher share of their production. So we have a move towards from an export-led economy in China to a domestic economy, and this reduces, of course, the amount of goods which are crossing borders in global value chains. The second point is that at the same time that China is exporting less and consuming more, they're also building domestic value chains. So in the car industry, for example, there is still many more of the parts incorporated into Chinese cars are actually made in China. In Chinese sold cars, including cars made by Western companies and Chinese companies, or Japanese companies in China. Third point is that there is a rise in cross-border data flow. So globalization of value chains in IT is increasing. And the fourth point, which I think, the fourth factor which is behind this, is the shift from an export-based value chain to a value chain which is much closer in order to get faster response in the market. So if you think of the Zara type of archetype, in which instead of actually ordering textile products from China 6 months in advance, there is actually a restocking every week in Zara stores based on the demand of the previous week. This, of course, is not compatible with very long and very far away production. And so actually Zara produces most of their product within Spain and Northern Africa. So this trend is also true in many other, also in electronics, in many other products. So this is behind the changes. So let me just show you some data about the trade intensity of value chains. You can see between 2007, there was an increase. 2007-17, there is a decrease. In most of them, in terms of computers, in terms of textiles, where actually value chains are becoming closer, and there is less reliance on long, geographically long value chains. You can see a great decrease, but there is also increase, for example, in labor-intensive services and in IT services. And this is basically the picture that we have. A general decline for factors which have to do with politics, but also other factors which are not necessarily political based. And then there is an increase in IT. If you look at the trade in IT, you can see in service, you can see that especially in IT-based services, you can see it's actually increasing faster than trade in goods. So you see, for example, especially at telecom and IT. This is share of service, the share of service trade. You can see that now telecom is 11% and IT 22% of service trade. If you look at, again, this is the same thing. If you look at the global compound annual growth rate, you can see that services actually are growing faster than goods producing sectors. If you look in terms of labor cost arbitrage, I think this is an interesting statistic. You can see that basically labor cost arbitrage has declined in many countries, with the exception of the US, where actually value chains based on labor cost arbitrage have actually increased. But in most other countries, they actually are stable or slightly decreased. One important aspect of the decrease in trade intensity of value chains is that an increasingly proportion of the gross output of goods in emerging markets is actually consumed locally. So what used to be an export-based economies are now actually becoming increasingly local economies, and the share of exports in the total production of Chinese producers is actually decreasing. And you can see this very clearly here, where there's an increase in export as a share of gross output in goods, especially in China. Let me just skip this. One aspect also that McKinsey notes is the increasing importance of emerging markets in terms of markets for goods for Western producers. You can see here that between 1995 and 2017, the share of the trade that goes from advanced country to advanced country has decreased, and the share of goods that went from advanced country to emerging markets has actually increased rather dramatically, and especially in machinery and equipment and computers and electronics. What is, I think, let me maybe go to, what is also interesting is that there is a dichotomy between the degree of intra-regional trade which is taking place. So value chains in the EU are becoming more international. Value chains in most other countries are becoming less international. It's also quite interesting to see there is already a trend in NAFTA by which value chains are becoming less international within the NAFTA area. On the other hand, within the EU, there is an increase in the degree of internationalization of the value chains. So and here, of course, this is partly linked to a large extent to political factors. So here you can see the influence of political factors. You see that, I think, better here. So here we have the growth of domestic intermediate output in terms of compound annual rate of growth on this axis. On the other axis, we have the change in traded intermediate inputs. So what is the extent of globalization of the value chain as opposed to what is the growth rate in total output? And you can see three groups of countries. The EU has actually a low rate of growth in terms of domestic intermediate output, but a higher degree of globalization of cross-regional trade flows. On the other hand, if you look at China, we have a very high rate of growth of intermediate input, but we have a lower level of globalization of intermediate output. So we have a divergence here between, and in the case of Asia Pacific, we have something in between. So we have actually a divergence, not only so the evolution of the value chain should really be looked also on a regional basis. If you look at the implication of new technologies for value chains, we have actually a very mixed pictures in which some trends are going to increase the globalization of value chains and other trends are going to reduce it. So if you think, for example, at 3D printing, which is here, obviously 3D printing is likely to reduce the globalization of value chains, as you actually, the companies making the goods can export the design and have people produce things more locally. But on the other hand, there are factors that will increase the globalization of value chain because, of course, e-commerce, for example, reduces transaction costs, and therefore is going to increase the globalization of the value chain. So, in conclusion, what is the impact of those trends for countries? Well, it really depends where you are located. If you are within an integrated trade bloc, or if you have a large domestic market, actually you're doing quite well. If you are outside a trade bloc, close on a trade bloc, or if you are a small country, then you should join a trade bloc. Needless to say, if you are inside a trade bloc and decide to leave the trade bloc, then you are really doing a very, very stupid.
Okay, so I think now it's time to call our panelists here and allow them a couple of minutes to react to Jean-François' speech, and then we will collect questions, comments from the group. Okay, so I think we could follow the same order. So we start with Mark.
Well, I really enjoyed Jean-François' presentation because it shows the value of using economic statistics. If you've got a really good state-of-the-art theory that is clear, it will map into data. And the data at this level enables you to compare. And so Jean-François is using a comparative approach of what were things like before, what were things like now. How do we explain the initial situation? How do we explain the change to the final situation? What has changed? And the growth of knowledge-intensive work, the increasing ability to effect division of labour in knowledge-intensive work with specialists at different locations, working together. It's a kind of supply chain in R&D almost, one might say. So I think that this is the route forward. One of the slides did mention one paper which recently appeared, which contains these confusing remarks about there being some middle ground between the market and the hierarchy. It's time we put an end to this sort of mumbo-jumbo. Middle ground just means we haven't got a clue what we're talking about. Somebody else should help us out. And the answer is understand subcontracting better. So I think clarity in statistics, clarity in theory, put the two together, it's really powerful stuff.
Well, that's a difficult comment. Thank you very much. It was a great use of the data and linked to issues of political factors, and I particularly like also the discussion about technology because it links a bit with my presentation on brands. I guess I talked about the situation. In my presentation, I was talking about how brands change our power in the global value chain changes with and how brands move along the value chain during periods of deglobalization. And I guess you also illustrated the power of technology in changes of the dynamics of global value chains. So, and you obviously showed both sides, you know, when it's good, when it helped globalization and when it stops globalization of core industries. And I also thought the aspect of the link to political factors was very relevant because it clearly can, you know, related also to the Rolf Petter presentation, you can, you know, internationalize or not global value chains. So thank you very much. I've learned and I'll actually process it into my story.
As an historian, I'd like to see the details between 2007 and 2000. I know they are not there because this is a very interesting period, a post-crisis period. When did it really start? And of course, it's a very good start. But is this a 2014 history? Is it 2010 history, or is it a general decline? That could be. I think that could be very interesting to understand the present situation.
Thank you. So perhaps we could start collecting some questions. So would you like to start?
One of the things that struck me about a lot of this is the role of technology, particularly information technology. One of the things with Jean-Francois' presentation, I was wondering how far information flows are actually substituting for a lot of flows that were previously goods related. So your integration, if you only measure movement of goods, you're actually missing the massive increase in data that is moving between countries, which is actually substituting for that. So that's one area where I thought information was important. The second area is I think it was only Teresa that mentioned trust, which is a really important factor. And technology is actually beginning to substitute for trust. I've just been doing a study with a student on blockchain, and there are actually people who feel that the technology of blockchain is actually superior. They prefer a blockchain arrangement to a personal relationship, and this is age-related. The younger you are, the more likely you are to trust technology and not trust personal relationships. So this is a trend that's going to increase. So one of the things, and of course it links very strongly to this whole underlying nature of division of labour, the impact of technology is not just things like printing, 3D printing. It's throughout the whole of the human relations that underlie the value chain. And I think that's absolutely crucial issue. I think there's other issues around how you measure value added and whether trade, I mean, the trade that you measure is a value measure. So if you've got higher value in the home country, you're going to have more, you're going to have less value trade, but that does not mean that the value chain is more important. It just means that the locations for adding value are perhaps becoming more concentrated. I could say more.
So should we collect some additional questions?
It's not exactly a question, it's probably a comment. I mean, we've seen in all presentations, reasons why there's deglobalization, shortening, supply chains, entrepreneurship. I think one sort of key aspect that's quite contemporary, we haven't sort of addressed at all, seems to be climate change. And I consider that climate change, given the impact it can have, both the perceived impact as well as the actual impact on global value chains or international supply chains, whichever way you want to see it, is massive and it's going to be even bigger as we sort of move forward. I think that's probably an aspect that needs to be addressed in that discussion.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I think all of you mentioned the role of politics and maybe the state and government, but not really as a core issue in any of the presentations, more like a side issue or an important issue that's not really being discussed. Is our conception of a multinational or global firm as a relatively stateless organization, is it something we should challenge to some extent? And should we link that to the role of the world system in core and periphery nations that may be changing the balance of geopolitics, and that impacts on what we call a legitimate global firm? That's more like a sociological thing.
Okay, I think we should come back to another question and then allow panelists to get.
Well, my question, thank you very much for your presentation. I think they were very well integrated in the sense that they dealt with many different aspects of global value chains. From a research perspective, I'm wondering if you can comment on what should be the appropriate level sort of at a macro level in terms of flows of information and goods and services. And we here also at the case level, we can talk about specific firms or specific industries. And as somebody who is interested in doing research in this area, I wouldn't call myself a young scholar anymore, but somebody who's a novice in the global value chain literature to a certain extent, collecting data is easy, but collecting the accurate data at the accurate level to be able to actually say something about how and where value is created or destroyed in these particular types of relationships, I find very difficult. And I find it difficult because of governance issues. I find it difficult because of ownership issues that are changing. You talked about brand, Teresa. I'm studying construction industry where the ownership changes from designers to builders and whatnot. So what is your human value in this case, and what would be the appropriate level of analysis that you would suggest to researchers going into this area?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bo. I think this is this point, if I can add, is an interesting, and very crucial issue, because there is an example that I'd like to mention, just listening at your comment. In Italy, a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of room on the newspaper about Candy. Candy is the dishwasher, washing machine company, backshoring production from China. And so big globalization, contraction of global value chain, and so on. But the story is that years ago, Candy did delocalized the production in China, labor cost, of course, reasons. And now the company has been acquired by higher Chinese company that decided to bring production back to Italy because of the made in, because of the quality effect. And so the brand and reputation issue that Teresa mentioned is very important. But the point is, is that the globalization? No, it's not. Because if you look at the Chinese enemy perspective, this is globalization. If you look at the Italian, this is reshoring. So it is particularly important to focus on the right unit of analysis. So yeah, so sorry for no specific order. You can choose the question that you want to answer, and no one wants to start.
So I think there's to answer both, I think there's a different level of analysis. Depends on what you're interested in, right? So are you interested in global trends and general statements? And are you interested in kind of figuring out what's behind the global trend, which is what McKinsey was trying to do? Or are you interested in the governance of a particular value chain? And then I think, as Mark was saying, we have all the tools, actually, in transaction cost theory, in explaining what is the makeup of a particular value chain. For example, as Mark was mentioning, does the person at the beginning of the value chain keep ownership of the product throughout the cycle, or do they break it up and sell it to somebody else, and then on to somebody else? And this has to do a lot with the ability of the firm to make money and quality control. Quality control is crucial, which has to do with reputation, which has to do with the joint product and the difficulty of separating what have been called performance inseparability, difficulty of separating the performance of one agent as opposed to another one. All of that can be understood, I think, quite well with transaction cost economics. So I think you can explain. So from that point of view, if you look at global value chains, then political aspects are becoming more important, geographic, transportation costs, and so on and so forth are becoming more important.
Well, to this question of level of analysis, at least from a historical point of view, I would say that the changes could be very interesting. More studies on this changes, because, for instance, there are some new literature now dealing with this subject, global history, for instance, Becker's book on cotton, that followed the kind of different geographical networks of production and consumption of cotton over time. And that gives another perspective of business when you study from the not only from the firm level or the industry, but from the whole chains. So that's it. I will argue for that. Regarding politics, as historians, I would say that maybe there is too much politics. I mean, a lot of the literature dealing with the interworld deglobalization deals with the impact of the trade agreements, the fascism, and all these kind of political things that are very, very important. But I mean, how business people reacted and behaved in a kind of new space or new situation is sometimes underestimated. That doesn't mean that there should be politics in national business, but that's a kind of reflection.
Just quickly, still going back to your question. I personally think that, what Jean-François said, all approaches have their virtues. But, going back to the case study, I personally think two very important points about doing case studies. One is contextualize. So you have to go back to the general data to actually position your case studies. And second, my experience as a business historian is that I do some research and find it's a company I like, but sometimes there is not much there that is abnormal to tell a story that no one knows. So I would say, it's nice to have a case study, like Rob Peter presented, but it has to be something new. And so the case study can't just be any case study. It has to be a case study that actually helps, deals with something that is new and helps eventually theory and provides a new angle to that particular industry or topic that you are analyzing.
Well, I'd like to go to addressing all four questions at once. At the end of a platitude. My platitude is this: the big picture is essential, but the devil's in the detail. And so I think in Peter's question, I would ask, is it all this information flow? Is it actually information like plans and designs at an intermediate stage of development where you've got vast data sets being laid around the world? Or are we talking about information coordination activities? It seems to me the less global our value chain is, the less information flow there will be internationally for coordination and international logistical purposes. So I think that this growth may well be this division of labour in R&D and design, which is clearly facilitated now by the kind of computer software, not only that generates the databases, but enables the transfer of these very large files in standard formats very, very cheaply. In terms of climate change, my view is business responds to regulation imposed by people. A lot of people in Britain at the moment are talking about the virtues of the self-regulated, purposeful company. And I sit there thinking, yes, but that is a real platitude. I don't know many big companies with powerful shareholders like pension funds and investment trusts who are going to do anything other than try to polish their brand by appearing to be ethical. So climate change will be addressed when the politicians can agree on a system of regulation. And then to analyse it, we will need detailed information on what the actual implications of these regulations are. I think the same thing applies to the point about politics. Without wishing to be rude, it's easy to say politics matter. I mean, like, for example, people go around and say institutions matter. But what the hell do you mean by institutions? So what is politics? It seems to me what matters is the detail of what the politicians actually decide on specific issues, such as regulations applying to particular industries, adoption of certain international product standards, that kind of thing. And unless researchers are willing to do the work to understand the detail, they're not going to be able to understand the evidence. That brings me back to Jean-François' stuff. How far do we need to know the detail in order to have confidence in the figures? I think the answer is we do need to know the detail. So if you take, say, GDP, lots of people just talk glibly about GDP. The GDP is not the same thing as GNP. Standards of living depend on GNP. And the difference between GNP and GDP is effectively net inward investment flow, which is an international business concept. So why are we just dangling around GDP as if it was a relevant thing to do? When we, from our very subject know, the GDP and GNP are different. We ought to be analysing those differences as well. So I think big picture stuff with attention to detail should be the way forward. But I agree, the problem is it's more costly and time consuming to do a proper job.
Thank you very much. So I think we still have time to collect more questions or comments.
So if I can piggyback on Mark's comments. So I've been involved in looking at FDI figures. And the total disconnect between FDI, total major disconnect between FDI figures and actually multinational activity in a particular country. Given the fact that, first of all, there's a problem of tax havens, so a good deal of, I mean, if you look at Chinese FDI, a good deal of Chinese FDI is, foreign FDI going into China is actually Chinese FDI around 30, even though this has changed depending on regulations. The fact that actually when you take the figures from Chinese FDI abroad and correct from pass-through to tax havens, you end up with a totally different geographic distribution of where the FDI goes. Much more going to, so that's also very important political implications. A lot less going to Asia, a lot more going to Europe, for example. Because a lot of this investment going to Europe is actually transiting through Hong Kong. And also the degree, the industrial distribution of those flows are much more towards sales affiliates and a lot less in services and not more in manufacturing. So a lot of what we talk about Chinese investment, acquiring, this is a work that Silva and I have done. A lot of the subsidiaries of Chinese firms are actually sales subsidiaries, promoting, supporting Chinese exports. A very small fraction of them are actually asset acquiring subsidiaries. So we are generalizing from actually erroneous data sets. The other thing which is also very important is that if you look at FDI flows are actually calculated, reported as net flows. So zero FDI flows to say, for example, from the UK to Zambia could either mean that there's zero investment from the UK to Zambia, or it could mean that that particular year the reimbursement of the affiliates of UK firms in Zambia just make up for the flows from the UK to Zambia. So how many of those studies that we've seen on spillovers, how many of those studies have we seen that actually looked, for example, corruption is a good example, where we actually are measuring inflow of FDI through FDI flow figures. And in fact, we cannot interpret FDI flow figures because of the fact that they are, except in special circumstances, without actually having some information, for example, what are the sales of UK firms in Zambia. So unless we have this information, we cannot interpret it.
Not only that, but every country actually, because I called OECD on this, and I said, can I compare Denmark's inflow of FDI to the UK to the US? And they said no, because every country collects it differently and measure it differently. And then they said, furthermore, if you have more than a 5-year period, you're no longer comparing apples and oranges, it's apples and sports cars. Because over a 5-year period, the method of collecting these data has changed in every country.
Yeah.
And so any comparison of FDI inflow and outflow across countries and across periods of time is not only flawed, it is wrong and should not be done at all.
So I had
Which is similar to what you have,
yeah.
because your study is based on, I don't know if you're corrected for that, but in a 10 to 12-year period of data on global value chain value added, the way that that's measured is completely different in 2000, 2017. So unless you correct it for that, you're also comparing oranges and wings of airplanes.
Yeah, I think that I can't recall, but I think that the methodology that they have actually takes that into account. But you are right in terms of, the big problem is reinvested earnings, right? So reinvested earnings, incorporated or not incorporated, some countries do, some countries don't.
Every country's a failure.
So we really should think very carefully about the data that we get.
Okay, we have a question.
Very, very interesting presentation, all of you. And I would like to ask you from a scholar, literally from a philosophical point of view. When the giudiziario direttivi, there are the six dimensions. The three dimensions is the local, the three dimensions is the global. Do you think that the dimension related to the local have been neglected in these years? And now, for instance, institutional context, there should be much more research on the local and not from a approach to global value chain, rather than looking at global value chain only from a local approach.
Just an observation, because I attended a workshop on Wednesday in Reading, which dealt with the issue in a way of what is the appropriate spatial unit of analysis in IB. And the point that I tried to make then is that there are a whole range of different levels of analysis. And we were talking earlier about levels of analysis in terms of macro versus micro data. But I think in terms of spatial structuring, there is also this issue. So in international business, the tradition is to treat each nation as a unit, assume uniformity within the nation and big differences between nations. And that's a sort of almost obsolete concept, I think, now. It never was a very good concept to begin with. And so basically, as barriers between nations have to some extent changed, the political and ideological differences of the post-colonial period to some extent aren't as sharp now as they were, say, 30 years ago. But I think at the sub-national level, there is an issue about when you drill down, say, to provinces or counties or states in the United States or whatever, or whether you really need to drill down to sub-regions of that, say, cities. And then within cities, do you need to discuss different suburbs? And one of the things that is, I think, quite striking about Japanese patterns of investing is that they seem easier to explain at a very micro level than they are at a more macro level. Because certainly research in Britain showed as early as the research was done in the early 1980s by a guy called Max Monday. He claimed to be confidential, I don't repeat this stuff to say, although I know it's actually true. He claimed that the Japanese like to invest in Welsh coal mining areas because the Welsh coal miners were short. And as the Japanese were short, they felt an affinity with them. Now, a more politically correct account would be to say that Japanese firms like to be in charge of the local community. They like to be the dominant employer and to have a role in the community. And in these Welsh towns, the mining community was very strong because the miners had all worked as teams underground. Every miner's life depended on every other miner's conscientiousness. And they found this to be a microcosm in the United Kingdom of the kind of culture they have in Japan. This suggests to me that in most countries you may be able to find a microcosm of your own country's culture. I think particularly in knowledge-based working, when you've got cosmopolitan people in a university system, it is very, very easy in a way to internationalize knowledge production because there is so much cultural similarity in exchange of ideas. People have studied in different countries, learned different languages, have friends and networks they keep in touch with on their mobile phone. And it's much more integrated than at the level of the manual worker. I think this is one of the things, therefore, that we need as IB scholars to get to grips with and to realise that if the local is really important, then it tells us what the difference is between, say, different kinds of industry in terms of where they nationalise. It also, I think, tells us why many working people find that globalization has atomized their existence, because their local community is now not integrated into a global system, whereas we as individuals are integrated into the global system wherever we go. And wherever we go, we meet people who've been educated in the same way we have, and we have so much in common. So I think the really sub-regional level is the level we ought to move to in our analysis.
I'm going to, I'm sure we'll have some critics here, but I actually think that point is very relevant for today and historically. Because today, I think it links with the issue of backshoring. Many companies are backshoring, but they are not necessarily producing in-house. They actually are outsourcing domestically. So I think the local level becomes important in some way in that respect. And then historically, for example, at the moment I'm working on the Medici in the Renaissance period, these companies, they were very early outsourcers, not just in other countries, but essentially in different regions of what is now Italy, but in that area. And actually that eventually then relates to development of some clusters in textile. So I'm looking at Medici Norte banking, so I'm looking at the wool trade. And they were clear, they were outsourcing most of their production. So what they did is they had the brand, and they had conceived the product, and they traded it, and they had a very, very powerful distribution network. So actually they were outsourcing most of their production. And that's, and the global, and they had a global product, they had a global, they were dispersed, producing in different parts, but essentially, it was in different areas of what is now Italy and some in Spain.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 3 minutes left. We have a last question. Oh, 2 last questions. Very quick, please. And comments.
I think in many countries, such as the one I'm coming from, there is a heated debate between two ideological camps. The liberals, they want to reduce tariffs and open up the economy to trade and import, and the protectionists that oppose that, and both have proven. And I'm wondering where this whole debate, especially the two tendencies that Mark has shown, are still sitting on the screen, take us as far as this debate goes on.
Thank you. Last question.
Yeah, I haven't really thought very much about branding and international value chains or global. It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot more value added comes at the end with the advertising. Apple is a perfectly good example. And how does that then affect the data? How does it affect, basically what the global value chain looks like?
Okay, thank you. I think I would allow 30 seconds each in order to, if you want, react, conclude this demo.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Apple, there's famous data on Apple's value chain, and I think that it's 140, a bit higher, 192 euros, I think, sale price of the Apple iPhone. Of that, about 50% is profit, and the value added by the Chinese basically assemble components, or assemble assemble components coming from South Korea, Japan, Germany, I think, yeah, and the value added by the Chinese worker is 7 euros. So basically, and this is of course another problem with trade statistics, right? Because of course the whole price of not the profit, but less profit, the whole price of the iPhone is counted as Chinese exports. But in fact, the value is, it's called a sliding curve, right? The value is at the design and at the marketing, at the branding.
Thank you for your question. I think there is this famous war between Dell, Intel, and Microsoft all wanting to put their brand on laptops, and that's very much associated with who has the power in the value chain of the computer. So the story that here I was basically dealing with the deglobalization and talking how in periods of globalization, trust and reputation, which symbolize the power of brands, which I do agree with Peter's point on the blockchain, but then we can find many examples where technology actually, leads to issues of trust and reputation, like social media, etc. But so I think that we would need to look at each individual case, and Apple is clearly a company that is appropriating most of the value added because of the power of the brand. But what is interesting to see is over time, where is the power of the brand? And Rolf Petter's story is again very interesting. Who has the power in the value chain with Codfish over the years? And it's very much the crucial link, which is very much also associated with the distribution process. So that I agree that in most Starbucks, etc., there's also studies to show most of the value added ends up being at the level of distribution of market.
Okay, so thank you. We are 1 minute late, so I think we could close and thank our Thank you.